October 25th, 1944, Surigao Strait, Philippines, 3:51 in the morning. The first salvo exploded against the hull of the Japanese battleship Yamashiro. Steel plates designed to withstand direct hits from the largest naval guns in existence simply disintegrated. A wall of fire raced through the ammunition magazines. Hundreds of sailors were vaporized before they could even scream. The second salvo arrived 12 seconds later, then the third, then the fourth. Shells were raining down from invisible ships hidden somewhere in the absolute darkness. The Japanese gunners fired back wildly, desperately, aiming at nothing because they could see nothing. Their lookouts, the finest in the Imperial Japanese Navy men, who had trained for years to see in complete darkness, stood frozen at their posts. They saw only blackness. 32 Japanese warships. 7 minutes. Every single one either sinking, burning, or fleeing in complete chaos. This was not a battle. This was an execution. The man who made it possible was not an admiral. He was not a general. He was a radio engineer from Massachusetts named David Harrison Cole, a man who wore thick glasses, a man who had never fired a weapon in combat, a man who spent years being told that his idea was ridiculous. But how did one man convince the most powerful navy in the world to trust machines over their own eyes? The answer begins not on a battlefield, but in a quiet laboratory in Washington 10 years earlier. David Harrison Cole was born in Minnesota in 1903. His father was a country doctor. His mother was a school teacher. He was small, quiet, terrible at sports. He wore thick glasses from the age of 8. But David had one quality that would prove more valuable than athletic ability or social skills. He was obsessed with understanding how things worked. As a teenager, he built his own radio receivers from spare parts. He conducted experiments in his bedroom that filled the house with strange noises and occasional electrical fires. His parents tolerated his hobby because it kept him occupied. They did not understand that their son was teaching himself the principles that would eventually save thousands of lives. David graduated from college in 1927 with a degree in physics. He applied to the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, mostly because they were hiring and the salary was acceptable. He had no particular interest in military applications. He simply wanted to continue his research into radio waves. For several years, David worked on routine projects. He improved radio communication equipment. He solved interference problems. He wrote technical reports that few people read. His superiors considered him competent but unexceptional. While David Cole tinkered with radio waves in his quiet laboratory across the Pacific Ocean, the Imperial Japanese Navy was perfecting the art of killing in darkness. For over 40 years, Japanese naval doctrine had been built around one central principle: darkness was a weapon. Their lookouts were selected based on exceptional natural eyesight, then subjected to years of exercises designed to push human perception beyond its normal limits. In August 1942, at the Battle of Savo Island, Japanese cruisers caught an Allied fleet completely by surprise. In less than 60 minutes, they sank 4 heavy cruisers and killed over 1,000 American and Australian sailors. The Allied commanders never saw them coming. American mothers were losing their sons to an enemy that could see in the dark. But in 1934, 8 years before Savo Island, David Cole discovered something that would change everything. October 15th, 1934. David was testing a radio transmitter when an aircraft flew overhead. At the exact moment the aircraft passed, the signal he was monitoring showed a brief but distinct fluctuation. David realized immediately what had happened. The radio waves were bouncing off the aircraft and returning to his receiver. He was detecting the plane not by seeing it, not by hearing it, but by measuring the reflection of invisible electromagnetic energy. If radio waves could detect aircraft, they could detect ships, submarines, anything, even in complete darkness, even through fog, even when human eyes were completely useless. This was the moment that would eventually kill 32 Japanese ships in 7 minutes. David spent the next 3 weeks working with manic intensity. He calculated theoretical detection ranges: 20 miles, 30 miles, perhaps more. He wrote a proposal for developing radio detection technology for military applications. He submitted the proposal with excitement that bordered on enthusiasm. The response was devastating. The concept is interesting but impractical. Radio waves are for communication, not detection. The Navy has invested heavily in training lookouts. Why would we abandon proven human capability for unproven machinery? The final line crushed him. No machine will ever replace the trained human eye. David Cole's funding request was rejected. He was advised to return to his regular duties and to pursue more practical research topics. Most men would have accepted the rejection. David Cole did not. He continued his experiments in secret, using equipment borrowed from other projects, working nights and weekends when the laboratory was empty. His colleagues thought he was wasting his time. His superiors thought he was slightly crazy. His wife Eleanor noticed the changes first. David came home later and later. Dark circles formed under his eyes behind those thick glasses. One night in the spring of 1935, Eleanor found him working in his small home office at midnight. "David, you barely sleep. Your health." He looked up from his calculations. His eyes were bloodshot. "I know I'm right, Eleanor. That's all that matters." She stood in the doorway for a long moment, her hand resting on her belly. She was 3 months pregnant. Then she turned and walked away. For 2 years, David refined his techniques in isolation. The main challenge was separating the transmitted signal from the returning echo. Both traveled at the speed of light. Both used the same frequency. How could a single antenna transmit and receive simultaneously without the transmission overwhelming the much weaker echo? Every expert told him it could not be done. The physics did not allow it. David did not believe them. In September 1936, David invented a device he called a duplexer. It allowed the same antenna to switch between transmitting and receiving thousands of times per second. The transmitted pulse would go out. The antenna would switch to receive mode in microseconds. The echo would return. It worked. By late 1936, David's prototype was working reliably. He could detect aircraft at distances exceeding 20 miles. He could track ships moving across the Potomac River. The technology that would revolutionize naval warfare was ready. But the Navy still was not interested. In late 1938, Commander James Michael Bradford walked through the doors of the Naval Research Laboratory on a routine inspection tour. Commander Bradford was everything David Cole was not: a career naval officer, a graduate of Annapolis, a man who had commanded destroyers and earned the respect of the fleet. But Bradford had something that would change everything. He had a younger brother. Ensign Thomas Bradford, 24 years old, was serving on the heavy cruiser USS Quincy in the Pacific Fleet. Thomas wrote home every week. His letters were full of enthusiasm and confidence. In his most recent letter, Thomas had written something that James kept thinking about. "Don't worry, big brother. Our lookouts are the best in the world. If the Japanese want to fight at night, we're ready for them." James Bradford believed his brother, but something about Thomas's confidence bothered him. A small voice in the back of his mind, a worry he could not quite name. On the afternoon of November the 3rd, 1938, Commander Bradford was walking down a corridor when a small man with thick glasses stepped into his path. "Commander, 15 minutes of your time," Bradford almost said no. But something about the intensity in the man's eyes made him pause. "15 minutes, Mr. Cole, David Cole." Bradford followed David to a small room. The room was dimly lit. Most of the light came from a glowing green screen mounted on a metal console. The screen showed a map of the Washington area covered with small, bright dots. "What am I looking at, Mr. Cole, aircraft commander?" "Every dot is an aircraft within 50 miles of this building." Bradford stepped closer. The dots moved slowly across the screen in real time. Dozens of them, utterly far beyond visual range on this overcast November afternoon. "How are you doing this, radio waves?" "I transmit a signal. It bounces off the aircraft. The echo returns. The machine measures the time delay and calculates distance and direction." Bradford's mind was racing through the implications. If this worked for aircraft, it would work for ships. In darkness, in fog, in any conditions where human eyes were useless. David pointed to an empty section of the screen. "Commander, in exactly 3 minutes, an aircraft will appear at this position heading northeast at approximately 200 miles per hour." Bradford looked at his watch. 3 minutes felt like an eternity. 2 minutes, still nothing. 1 minute. Bradford found himself holding his breath. 30 seconds. A dot appeared, exactly where David had predicted, moving exactly as he had described. Bradford felt his world shift. "That was a commercial flight approaching National Airport," David said quietly. "I calculated its arrival using data from radar stations 30 miles away." Bradford understood immediately what he was seeing. This was the ability to know where the enemy was before the enemy knew you existed. This was the end of surprise attacks. This was the end of Japanese night superiority. This could save his brother's life. How long have you been working on this 4 years, Commander? 4 years this technology had existed, and the fleet did not have it. Bradford felt anger rising in his chest. Why doesn't the Navy have this equipment? David's face hardened. Because no machine will ever replace the trained human eye. That's what they told me. 4 years ago, 2 years ago, 6 months ago. Bradford made a decision in that moment, a decision that would change both their lives. I want to see this demonstrated under operational conditions, Mr. Cole. Can you do that? David nodded slowly. Give me 6 weeks to prepare. Within a week, Bradford began advocating for radar within Naval Command. He had the credentials that David lacked. He spoke the language of operational officers. He could translate scientific capability into tactical advantage. Together they developed a plan, a demonstration so convincing that even the most skeptical admiral would have to accept the evidence. But there was one man who stood between radar and the fleet. Admiral Richard Thornton Hayes, Chief of Naval Operations, was 61 years old in 1940. He had served for over 35 years. He had commanded battleships, and he believed radar was a complete waste of time. Hayes was not stupid. He was not corrupt. He was a man haunted by a memory. 1918, the North Atlantic. Hayes had been a young officer when a German U-boat attacked through heavy fog. The submarine had approached to torpedo range completely undetected. Then a lookout had shouted a warning. Periscope wake off the starboard bow. The destroyer had turned hard. The torpedo had passed 20 yards astern. That lookout, a 20-year-old sailor from Ohio, had saved 200 lives that night, including Hayes's own life. Hayes had never forgotten that moment. A human being with human eyes had saved the ship. Not technology, not instruments, not machines. That lesson had shaped his entire career. Men were reliable. Men could adapt. Technology failed. Men endured. When David Cole formally requested funding in the spring of 1940, Admiral Hayes personally reviewed the proposal. David was not even allowed to present his case directly to Hayes. Instead, he faced a committee of senior officers. The officers had already made up their minds. A captain spoke for the group. Mr. Cole, the Navy has invested considerably in training our lookouts. These men can identify ship types at 15 miles under good conditions. You are asking us to replace proven human capability with unproven machinery. David tried to explain. The captain was unmoved. And when this machinery fails, when a vacuum tube burns out at a critical moment, what then? Our lookouts do not suffer mechanical failures. Our lookouts do not require spare parts. Our lookouts have served this Navy for 100 years. The committee rejected the funding request unanimously. David was advised to continue his theoretical research, but to abandon any expectation of fleet deployment. But the rejection was not the worst part. 3 weeks later, David received a letter. Certain senior officers had expressed concerns about his continued advocacy. They felt it was becoming embarrassing. Perhaps his talents would be better employed elsewhere. David Cole was being told to shut up or get out. He sat in his small office holding the letter. Eleanor was pregnant with their first child. He could not afford to lose his job, could not afford to keep fighting for a technology that no one wanted. But he could not give up either. He thought about the aircraft he could track at 30 miles, the ships he could detect through fog, the lives that could be saved. He thought about Commander Bradford's brother serving on a cruiser in the Pacific, trusting his life to lookouts who could not see in darkness. David made his choice. He would not give up. Commander Bradford had a plan. If they could not convince operational command, they would go around them. The Navy's Bureau of Ships operated with some independence from Admiral Hayes. If they could convince the Bureau that radar was essential for future ship construction, the technology might survive. They requested one official test, conducted under genuine combat conditions, observed by officers from the Bureau of Ships. If radar failed, both careers were finished. If it succeeded, the Bureau might approve installation regardless of what Admiral Hayes believed. They had 6 weeks to prepare. The demonstration was scheduled for January 1940 off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia. The conditions would be brutal: complete darkness, heavy rain, near zero visibility, a target ship operating under blackout conditions somewhere in the Atlantic. David spent 6 weeks preparing. Every component was tested repeatedly. He slept 4 hours a night. He stopped coming home for dinner. Eleanor stood in the doorway of his study one evening watching him work. Their son was 3 months old, sleeping in the next room. David had not held him in days. After the demonstration, she said quietly, "You promised me, after the demonstration, you'll rest." David did not look up from his calculations. "After the demonstration, I promise." Eleanor closed the door softly. They both knew it was a lie. The night of the demonstration arrived with weather that seemed designed to destroy everything David had built. Heavy cloud cover blocked all starlight. Rain squalls moved through unpredictably. Visibility dropped to less than a quarter mile. 3 target ships were positioned somewhere in the darkness. The observers from the Bureau of Ships stood on the bridge with notebooks ready and skepticism evident in their posture. David stood beside the radar operator. His heart pounded. His hands were shaking. For the first 15 minutes, the screen showed nothing but empty ocean. One of the observers checked his watch. Another whispered something to his colleague. Then the first contact appeared. 22 miles. Bearing 315. David announced the position calmly. The contact was far beyond visual range, completely invisible in the darkness and rain. As they closed the distance, David continued calling updates. 20 miles, 18 miles, 15 miles. At 12 miles a second, contact appeared. The radar was tracking both targets simultaneously. The Bureau officers leaned forward. This was revolutionary. At 8 miles from the first contact, the radar screen went completely blank. Every contact disappeared. The display showed nothing but empty static. David felt his stomach drop. One of the Bureau officers demanded an explanation. What went wrong? Mr. Cole. David forced himself to think. The radar was not broken. Something else was happening. Then he understood. The rain squall they were passing through was so intense that it was absorbing the radar signal. The water droplets themselves were creating interference. He waited. 30 seconds, 45 seconds. The squall passed, the contacts reappeared. Exactly where they should have been. Both targets still tracking. David explained what had happened. The Bureau officers took notes. Rain could temporarily block detection. Operators would need to understand this. But the radar itself was not at fault. At 4 miles from the first target, the destroyer's lookouts finally spotted it visually. They had found a blacked-out ship in near-zero visibility, guided entirely by radar for 18 miles of approach. The demonstration concluded at 4:30 in the morning. Total time 4 hours. Targets located 3. False contacts 0. Equipment failures 0. One Bureau officer summarized the result in his official report. This technology represents a fundamental shift in naval capability. Installation on combat vessels should proceed immediately. Within 6 weeks, the Bureau of Ships approved radar for installation on all new destroyer construction. Within 3 months, retrofit programs were underway for existing vessels. Admiral Hayes remained skeptical, but the bureaucratic momentum had shifted beyond his ability to stop it. David Cole had won his battle against the brass. But winning approval was only the beginning. American industry had never manufactured radar components in quantity. Specialized vacuum tubes, precision electronics, calibrated displays. Everything had to be produced from scratch. David found himself traveling constantly, factory to factory, shipyard to shipyard, solving production problems, training workers who had never seen such technology. At a Philadelphia shipyard in early 1941, David stood among 50 workers on the assembly line. They were installing radar systems on destroyers bound for the Atlantic. Young men and women, most barely out of high school, trying to understand technology that seemed like magic. A young woman raised her hand. Her fingers were stained with solder. "Mr. Cole, what if I connect this wrong? What if the radar fails because of me?" David looked at her, really looked at her. She was 19, maybe 20, the same age as the sailors who would depend on this equipment. "Then you learn from the mistake and fix it." That's what I did. Every day for 6 years. The technology failed 100 times before it worked once. But we kept trying because lives depended on it. The young woman nodded. Around her, the other workers straightened slightly. They were not just assembling equipment. They were saving lives. David spent 3 weeks at that shipyard, working alongside the assembly crews, showing them how to test each connection, how to recognize failure points. how to trust the machines they were building. Eleanor arrived at the shipyard on the last day. Their son was walking now. She carried him on her hip as she navigated through the factory floor. David saw them from across the room. He started to walk toward them. Then a supervisor called his name. A problem with one of the radar sets. David turned back to the equipment. Eleanor stood there for 5 minutes, watching her husband work. Then she carried their son back to the car and drove home alone. Training was equally challenging. Radar operators needed to learn an entirely new way of perceiving combat. They had to trust information from a screen, not from their eyes. Many commanding officers simply did not believe in radar, even after it was installed. Some captains ordered the equipment disconnected, claiming it interfered with their lookouts. Progress was agonizingly slow. In November 1941, David returned home after a 3-week trip. He looked exhausted. His face was gray. The dark circles under his eyes had become permanent. Eleanor met him at the door. She was 7 months pregnant with their second child. "David, your doctor says you're hard. I'll rest when radar is deployed, Eleanor. Just a few more months. What if you don't live to see it?" David had no answer. He walked past her into his study. Eleanor stood in the hallway, her hand on her belly. Their son tugged at her skirt, asking where Daddy was going. She did not know how to answer him. On December 7th, 1941, everything changed. David was in his laboratory on a Sunday morning when the call came through. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. Japanese aircraft. Multiple waves. The Pacific Fleet was burning. Over the next hours, reports filtered in. 2,400 Americans dead. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed. Nearly 200 aircraft lost. David pulled out his original proposal from 1934. He read his own words from 7 years earlier. Radio detection technology could provide early warning of approaching aircraft at ranges exceeding 20 miles. This would allow defensive forces time to prepare and potentially prevent surprise attacks. 20 miles, 20 minutes of warning. What most people did not know was that some radar equipment had already been installed at Pearl Harbor. The technology existed, the machines were there, but they were not fully operational. Operators were not properly trained. Commanders did not trust the readings. The radar had detected the incoming Japanese aircraft that morning, but the warning had been dismissed as a malfunction, as friendly aircraft, as something that could not possibly be what the machine was saying it was. Admiral Hayes sat alone in his office that Sunday evening. Casualty reports covered his desk. Names, ranks, ages, so many in their early 20s. He pulled David Cole's proposal from his files, the one he had personally recommended for rejection in 1940. He read it slowly. Every word. Detection ranges of 20 miles or more are theoretically possible. This would provide advance warning sufficient to prepare anti-aircraft batteries. Hayes sat in silence for a long time. Then he picked up his telephone. December 10th, 1941. David Cole and Commander Bradford were summoned to Admiral Hayes's office. Hayes sat behind his desk, looking older than his 61 years. "Mr. Cole," Hayes said without preamble, "the Navy requires your full cooperation in accelerating radar deployment. Whatever resources you need, whatever authority, you have it." There was no apology. Pride would not allow it. But David heard what Hayes could not say. "You were right. I was wrong, and men died because I would not listen." After the meeting, Bradford and David walked down the corridor in silence. "That wasn't easy for him," Bradford said finally. David's voice was bitter. "Thousands died because he wouldn't listen." Bradford thought of Thomas serving somewhere in the Pacific on the USS Quincy. "Thousands more will live because he's listening now." Take the win, David. By early 1942, radar-equipped ships were deploying to the Pacific. Early combat reports were encouraging. Ships with radar could detect incoming air raids with enough warning to prepare. American losses from surprise attacks began to drop. But the Japanese had noticed something strange. Their night attacks were being detected before they arrived. Their advantage in darkness was disappearing. Intelligence reports from captured prisoners revealed growing confusion among Japanese crews. American ships appeared to know where Japanese forces were located even when visual contact was impossible. None of them understood that the fundamental nature of naval detection had changed forever. August 9th, 1942. The Battle of Savo Island. Commander James Bradford was at his desk in Washington when the messenger arrived. The young ensign looked pale. He handed Bradford an envelope without meeting his eyes. Bradford's hands were steady as he opened it. USS Quincy sunk Savo Island. Stop all hands lost. Stop Ensign Thomas Bradford killed in action stop. The words blurred. All hands lost. Thomas was 24 years old. Bradford sat alone in his office as the afternoon light faded. He pulled Thomas's last letter from his desk drawer. The paper was worn from repeated readings. Don't worry, big brother. Our lookouts are the best in the world. If the Japanese want to fight at night, we're ready for them. The lookouts saw nothing. Japanese cruisers had appeared out of the darkness like ghosts. 4 American cruisers sunk in less than an hour. Over 1,000 men killed. The Japanese escaped without losing a single ship. Thomas had trusted the Navy's training, the Navy's doctrine, the Navy's lookouts, who were supposed to be the best in the world, and Thomas died blind in the darkness. Bradford sat there until full dark. When he returned to David Cole's laboratory the next morning, David knew immediately that something had changed. My brother was at Savo Island, Bradford said without preamble. Our lookouts saw nothing. The Japanese saw everything. It was a perfect ambush. Bradford's eyes were hard. Help me make sure it never happens again. This was no longer about innovation. This was personal. Across the Pacific Ocean in a research facility outside Tokyo, Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto was fighting his own desperate battle. Yamamoto was 36 years old in late 1942. Like David Cole, he was an electrical engineer, often ignored by superiors. Like Cole, he was fighting an uphill battle in a culture that valued tradition over technology. But unlike Cole, Yamamoto was losing. Yamamoto had been piecing together fragments of information for months, captured American equipment, interrogated prisoners. His conclusion was alarming. The Americans possessed a radio wave detection system that could locate targets in complete darkness. It was deployed across most major American surface combatants. Japanese forces were being slaughtered because of it. The statistics were catastrophic. Losses in night engagements had increased by 340% since American radar deployment began. At the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay in November 1943, an American force defeated a larger Japanese force in less than 45 minutes. A surviving Japanese officer described it simply. We could not fight what we could not see. The shells arrived from nowhere. Yamamoto received urgent orders. Find the weakness. Develop countermeasures. Give our forces a chance to survive. His team worked around the clock. Radar warning receivers that could detect American transmissions, jamming devices to interfere with signals, chaff to create false targets. But these countermeasures had severe limitations. Warning receivers told Japanese ships they were being detected, but not where the detector was. Chaff created temporary confusion that experienced operators learned to identify. Jamming devices often interfered with Japanese communications as much as American radar. The technological gap was widening every month. Yamamoto had personal stakes in this race. His younger brother Kenji served on the heavy cruiser Mogami. The letters from Kenji had grown increasingly desperate. Big brother, our night attacks aren't working anymore. The Americans know where we are before we can see them. Men are saying demons can see through darkness. I know that's superstition, but something is very different. Yamamoto worked frantically to protect Kenji and the fleet, but he was fighting against David Cole's 10-year head start, against American industrial might. He wrote to Kenji in early 1944, I have done everything possible to match American technology, but they have something we lack. Years of preparation, and most importantly, they believed in it from the beginning. In his quarters late at night, Yamamoto would read Kenji's letters and think about the American engineer he had never met, the man who had started this technological race 10 years ago, the man who was winning. Sometimes Yamamoto wondered what David Cole looked like, whether he had a family, whether he understood that his invention was killing thousands of Japanese sailors who were just following orders, just trying to survive. Yamamoto looked at a photograph on his desk. Kenji in his naval uniform, 22 years old, smiling, confident, just like Thomas Bradford had been. While Yamamoto raced to develop countermeasures on the American side, a different crisis was developing. The early radar sets were temperamental. Tropical humidity caused vacuum tubes to fail. Salt spray corroded electronics. In some months, equipment failure rates exceeded 40%. Ships reported radar outages at critical moments. Critics who had never accepted radar used these failures as ammunition. Then came February 1944. The cruiser USS Houston was operating in the Java Sea when her radar failed completely during a Japanese night attack. Not from enemy action, from mechanical failure. Without electronic detection, the Houston was blind. Japanese destroyers closed a torpedo range undetected. 2 torpedoes struck the engine room. 168 men were killed. The survivors spent hours in the water before rescue. The Houston disaster forced a brutal reassessment. Radar was the difference between life and death in Pacific night operations. David was recalled to lead an emergency reliability improvement program. For 4 months, he traveled from shipyard to shipyard, analyzing failures, redesigning components, developing maintenance procedures. The work was exhausting. David slept 4 hours a night when he slept at all. His heart palpitations grew worse. His doctor warned him that he was heading for a serious cardiac event. Eleanor's patience had worn thin. She appeared at a shipyard where David was working in early June 1944. Their son was 2 years old. She had brought the boy to see his father. "David, this has to stop. You're killing yourself." He looked at her across the shipyard. She was holding their son. The boy was reaching for him. "After this crisis, I promise." "You promised that a year ago." Eleanor's voice broke. "What good is saving the world if you're not alive to see it?" David had no answer. He watched his wife carry their son back to the parking lot. Then he returned to the radar equipment. Eleanor cried the entire drive home. Their son asked why Mommy was sad. She told him Daddy was helping sailors. She did not tell him that Daddy was slowly dying to do it. By mid-1944, radar reliability had improved from 60% to over 90%. The crisis was survived. But the toll on David was visible. His hair had gone gray. His face was gaunt. Behind those thick glasses, his eyes carried weariness that no amount of sleep could cure. In October 1944, the Japanese Navy attempted its most ambitious operation since Pearl Harbor. 4 naval forces were converging on the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. If they succeeded, they would destroy the transports supplying the Philippine landings. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura commanded the Southern Force. 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 4 destroyers, tasked with threading Surigao Strait under darkness. Aboard the heavy cruiser, Mogami sailed Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto with his latest countermeasure equipment. His younger brother Kenji served in the ship's damage control section. Yamamoto found Kenji before the fleet departed. The 2 men stood on deck watching the sunset over the Philippines. "Stay close to the damage control station when the fighting starts," Yamamoto said. "The Americans will target the engine rooms." Kenji smiled. "Don't worry, big brother. We've faced Americans before." Yamamoto did not smile back. "This is different. They can see us now. We cannot see them." Kenji studied his brother's face. "You're frightened." Yamamoto nodded slowly. "Yes, and you should be too. But we go anyway, because duty demands it." The brothers embraced. Neither spoke the thought that was in both their minds. This might be the last time. Against them stood Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's task force. 6 battleships, 8 cruisers, 28 destroyers. Every single American ship was equipped with radar. Oldendorf knew the Japanese were coming. Patrol aircraft had tracked them all day. As darkness fell, American radar operators watched their screens with focused intensity. The trap was set. In Washington, Captain Bradford monitored radio reports. He thought of Thomas as he watched the updates. This is what Thomas needed: the ability to see the enemy before the enemy saw you. David sat in the Naval Research Laboratory receiving real-time reports. Eleanor was beside him. She had insisted on coming. If this was the culmination of everything David had worked for, she wanted to be there. "You should rest," she said quietly. "Not until I know if it works." "David, it already works. You've proven that 100 times. He shook his head. "Not like this. Not against the best night fighters in the world." Eleanor took his hand. It was trembling. She could feel his pulse racing. The reports came in throughout the night. American PT boats making first contact. Japanese ships entering the strait. Destroyers launching torpedo attacks. And then the main barrage began. "Oldendorf's battleships have opened fire," the radio operator said. "All ships engaging. Japanese column under heavy bombardment." David closed his eyes. He prayed that the technology would work, that Thomas Bradford and the Houston sailors in the Pearl Harbor dead would not have died for nothing. At 3:51 in the morning, hell arrived. On the Mogami's bridge, Yamamoto heard explosions ahead, saw fires. His radar warning receiver was screaming. American radar everywhere. He tried to activate jamming equipment. It failed. The countermeasures he had worked so desperately to develop were useless against the coordinated American attack. Yamamoto found Kenji at the damage control station. "Brother, get below. This is going to be bad." Kenji shook his head. "My station is here." Then Yamamoto heard it, the whistle of incoming shells. He threw himself flat. The 8-inch shell hit the superstructure directly above them. The explosion was deafening. Metal shrieked. Fire bloomed. Yamamoto was thrown against a bulkhead. When he looked up, the damage control station was gone. Just twisted metal and fire. Kenji was gone. Yamamoto lay there in the darkness, blood running down his face, the ship listing beneath him. He thought about the American engineer, David Cole, the man he had tried so hard to defeat. "You won," Yamamoto whispered. "We trained for 40 years. You won." The Mogami capsized at 4:05. Yamamoto died before the ship sank. When dawn broke over Surigao Strait, the American victory was absolute. Japanese losses. 2 battleships sunk. 3 cruisers destroyed. 4 destroyers sunk. Over 4,000 Japanese dead. American losses. 1 PT boat sunk. 39 men killed. The ratio was more than 100 to 1. David sat in silence as the final reports came in. Eleanor was crying quietly beside him. Not from sadness, from relief. But David was not thinking about victory. He was thinking about Yamamoto, a man he had never met, a Japanese engineer who had fought the same battles, who had sailed into Surigao knowing it was hopeless. 2 brothers, Thomas Bradford and Kenji Yamamoto, both dead in night battles. One because his side lacked the technology, one because his side faced it. The cruel mathematics of war. A Japanese officer captured weeks later described the experience. "We trained for 40 years to fight at night. We believed our lookouts could defeat any technology. We were wrong. The Americans did not fight us. They executed us. We never saw them. We never had a chance." News of Surigao Strait spread through both fleets within hours. For American sailors, it was confirmation that radar had transformed warfare. For Japanese forces, it was psychologically devastating. Japanese commanders began avoiding night engagements entirely. In the 6 months following the Surigao Strait, Japanese losses had accelerated to unsustainable levels. The Imperial Japanese Navy was being systematically annihilated. In 1944, David Harrison Cole received the Presidential Medal for Merit, the highest civilian honor for wartime contribution. But David deflected credit. The technology was useless until it was trusted, he said. Trust came from men willing to bet their lives on machines they did not fully understand. Conservative estimates suggested radar had saved over 100,000 American lives during the Pacific War. The physicist with thick glasses and an impossible dream had changed the course of history. But the price had been high. David was 41 and looked 60. His heart was damaged beyond repair. The doctor said he had maybe 10 years. Eleanor held him as they left the medal ceremony. "You did it, David. You can rest now," he nodded. But both of them knew he would never really rest. When the war ended in August 1945, David Harrison Cole was 42 years old. He had spent a decade fighting 2 wars simultaneously, against Japanese and German forces, against American bureaucracy. He had won both, but victory left him exhausted. The world moved quickly. The atomic bomb demonstrated new power that made everything else seem secondary. Resources flowed toward nuclear development. By 1946, the government was cutting military budgets. Radar was now established technology, no longer requiring significant funding. David returned to the Naval Research Laboratory. But his role had diminished. Younger scientists were leading new projects. The man who taught machines to see in the dark found himself writing reports that few people read. His health continued to deteriorate. The endless hours had taken a toll that peacetime could not repair. His doctor was blunt. The heart damage was permanent. David needed to reduce stress. David nodded at the advice. Then he returned to the laboratory and worked late as he always had. Eleanor had learned to live with her husband's obsession, but watching him slowly destroy himself was different. Their son was growing up barely knowing his father. In 1948, Eleanor made a decision. She took their son and moved in with her sister in Baltimore. She left a note on the kitchen table. I love you, David, but I cannot watch you die slowly in that laboratory. When you are ready to choose your family over your work, we will be waiting. David found the note when he came home at 10 o'clock. He read it 3 times. Then he carefully folded it and placed it in his desk drawer. He told himself he would call her tomorrow, explained that he just needed a few more months to finish his projects. He did not call the next day or the day after. The months became years. In 1951, David's heart finally gave a warning that could not be ignored. He collapsed in the laboratory. A massive angina attack. The doctor said another attack like that would probably kill him. Eleanor came to the hospital. She sat beside his bed and held his hand. Was it worth it, David? He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in years. She had aged. They both had. Their son was 9 years old. David had missed most of those years. I saved lives, Eleanor. Tens of thousands of lives. I know. Her voice was gentle. But you lost yours doing it. David had no answer. Eleanor came back after he was released. Not because she believed he would change, but because she could not bear to let him die alone. They rebuilt something that resembled a marriage. David worked fewer hours. He came home for dinner most nights. But something essential had broken between them. They were companions now, not lovers. Partners in survival rather than partners in life. Their son became an engineer himself, working on computers. In the evenings, father and son would sit together in the study, David teaching him about circuits and signals, sharing the passion he had never quite managed to share when his son was young. Those evenings were good, but they could not undo the years that had been lost. David continued at the Naval Research Laboratory until 1966. He published technical papers. He advised younger researchers who barely knew his name. He watched radar technology evolve far beyond what he had imagined. Phased array systems, synthetic aperture radar, over-the-horizon detection, each advancement built on the foundation he had laid. David retired at 63. His heart could not handle the stress anymore. The doctors gave him 5 years, maybe 10. Eleanor tried to make those years good ones. They traveled when David's health allowed. They visited their son and grandchildren. David taught his grandson to build radio receivers from spare parts just as he had learned as a boy. In the evenings, David sat in his study surrounded by old papers, calculations from the 1930s, reports from the war years, letters from sailors who had written to thank him. He read those letters often. They were proof that the cost had been worth it. On quiet nights, Eleanor would find him sitting in the dark, staring at those papers. She learned not to ask what he was thinking. She knew. He was thinking about all the lives saved and all the life he had missed living while he saved them. David Harrison Cole died on March 12, 1992. He was 89 years old. The heart that had been damaged by decades of stress finally gave out in his sleep. Eleanor was beside him. The obituaries were brief. The Washington Post ran 3 paragraphs. Radar pioneer dies at 89. Most newspapers ran nothing at all. Most Americans had never heard his name. The technology he created had become so ubiquitous that its origins were forgotten. David's funeral was small. Eleanor, their son and grandchildren, a few colleagues. Captain James Bradford, now a retired admiral, made the trip from Florida. He was 83 and walked with a cane. Bradford spoke at the service. David Cole saved my life, though we never served together. He saved thousands of lives of men who never knew his name. He fought a war against skepticism that was harder than the war against our enemies, and he won both. Bradford stood beside the grave after others departed. Eleanor approached him. Thank you for coming, Admiral. Bradford shook his head. I should have come more often while he was alive. You both did what you had to do, yes. Bradford looked at the simple headstone. But I wonder if he knew. At the end, if he understood what he had accomplished. Eleanor smiled sadly. He knew. He read letters from the sailors, every single one. He kept them all. Good. Bradford nodded. That's good. But here is what most people do not know. The legacy David left was not measured in obituaries. It was measured in systems that still protect lives every day. Air traffic control systems trace their lineage to David's work. Weather radar that warns communities of approaching storms uses principles he established. Navigation systems, collision avoidance technology, military defense networks, all descended from the machines he taught to see in the dark. By conservative estimates, radar technology has saved over 2 million lives since World War II. When you add weather warnings, maritime navigation, and military applications, the number becomes incalculable. The technology has become so fundamental to modern life that most people never think about it, which may be the ultimate measure of its success. But there is one more chapter, one final twist. In 1985, 40 years after the war ended, the Naval Research Laboratory conducted a historical review. Researchers examined thousands of projects spanning decades. The conclusion was striking. Among all technologies developed since 1923, radar remained the single most impactful innovation. In terms of lives saved and military capabilities enhanced, nothing else came close. The researchers decided to locate the original prototype. The first radar set David had used to demonstrate the technology in 1938, the machine that changed everything. They searched archives, contacted retired engineers, traced storage records. The original prototype was nowhere to be found, lost somewhere in the chaos of wartime expansion, assumed destroyed. For nearly 20 years it remained that way. Then came 2003. Harold Patterson was cleaning out his late father's garage in Baltimore. His father had worked at the Naval Research Laboratory during the 1940s. Harold found a wooden crate buried under decades of equipment. Inside were vacuum tubes, cables, oscilloscope components, circuit boards with hand-soldered connections. Harold almost threw it away. Then he noticed a small metal plate. Naval Research Laboratory, Experimental Radio Detection Equipment, 1936. Harold contacted the laboratory, expecting to be told the items were worthless. The archivist asked him to describe the components. Harold did his best. Serial numbers, configuration. There was a long silence. "Mr. Patterson, I need you to not move anything. We're sending someone immediately." 2 days later, 3 researchers arrived. They spent 4 hours examining the components, taking photographs, cross-referencing serial numbers. Finally, the lead researcher looked up at Harold. "Do you understand what you have here? This is David Cole's original experimental radar set, the prototype that convinced the Navy to adopt radar technology. We've been looking for this for 20 years. How did my father end up with it?" The researcher examined a maintenance log. In 1943, there was a critical shortage of vacuum tubes. Ships were having radar failures in combat. The laboratory cannibalized every piece of equipment for spare parts, including the original prototype. So it was dismantled to repair other radar sets. Yes, the researcher's voice was quiet. The original machine was sacrificed so the technology could survive. Your father kept the components, probably thinking they might be useful someday. After the war, he stored them and forgot. Harold thought about that. So the machine that started it all destroyed itself to save the fleet. That's one way to look at it. The researcher carefully lifted a vacuum tube. A more accurate way is that David Cole's invention succeeded so completely that even the prototype became expendable. The idea was more important than the object. Harold donated the components to the Smithsonian Institution. They are displayed in the National Museum of American History alongside other World War II artifacts. Most visitors walk past without stopping. The display is not dramatic, just old electronics in a glass case. Few realize they are looking at fragments of the machine that taught humanity to see in the dark. And perhaps that is fitting. David Cole never sought fame. He sought results. He wanted to build something that worked, something that would save lives, something that would prove the experts wrong. He achieved all of that. If his name is not remembered as widely as it deserves, his work is remembered every time an aircraft lands safely through fog, every time a weather warning saves a community, every time a ship navigates through darkness toward home. The admirals who rejected him are forgotten. The bureaucrats who tried to bury his work are forgotten. The skeptics who called him crazy are forgotten. But every radar screen that glows in the darkness carries something of the man who made it possible. This is not just a story about technology. This is a story about the power of conviction, about what happens when one person refuses to be silenced. David Cole gave everything to his work, his health, his marriage for a time, his relationship with his son during crucial years, the normal life he might have lived. Was it worth it? Eleanor was asked that question many times after David died. Journalists, historians, researchers. Her answer was always the same. David saved over 100,000 lives during the war, over 2 million since then. He missed years of his son's childhood. He damaged his heart beyond repair. He spent decades being ignored and dismissed. She would pause, look at whoever was asking, and say quietly, "You do the math. You decide if that trade was worth it." But I'll tell you what David believed. He believed that one person who refuses to give up can change the world. He believed that American innovation comes from individuals, not institutions. He believed that machines could see in the dark when everyone told him it was impossible. And he was right. History is filled with David Coles, men and women whose names we have forgotten, but whose inventions we use every day. The innovators who changed the world and then faded into obscurity because their work became so common that no one remembered it was once considered impossible. David Cole died almost forgotten, but he died knowing he had been right, that the letters from sailors thanking him for saving their lives were proof that the impossible dream had become reality. In the end, that was enough. Consider the physicist who wore thick glasses and worked alone while experts said he was wasting his time. Consider the man who was told that no machine would ever replace the human eye. Consider the innovator who spent a decade fighting bureaucrats and his own failing health. He was told it was impossible. He did it anyway. 32 Japanese warships vanished in 7 minutes at Surigao Strait. Over 4,000 Japanese sailors died that night. American losses were 39 men. That happened because one man believed machines could see in the dark, because he refused to stop believing even when everyone told him he was wrong, because he was willing to pay the price that conviction demands. The admirals are forgotten. The skeptics are forgotten. The bureaucrats are forgotten. But David Cole's impossible dream lives on, in every airport, on every ship, in every storm warning, in the fundamental transformation of how humanity perceives the world. He taught machines to see in the dark. And in doing so, he taught us that no dream is too impossible if you are willing to fight for it. No obstacle is too great if you refuse to give up. No expert opinion is more powerful than one person who knows they are right. That is the lesson. That is the legacy. That is what we must remember. One man, thick glasses, an impossible dream, and the world was never the same.